The colony of redstone flats didn't die loudly. That was the first thing Dr. Marachin noticed when the emergency extraction team pulled her off the transport shuttle and walked her through the settlement's main corridor. She had expected devastation, shattered glass, scorched walls, and the visible evidence of something violent passing through. She had prepared herself mentally for carnage. She had rehearsed her clinical detachment during the 3-day journey from the Meridian Research Station, telling herself over and over that she was a xenobiologist, not a soldier, and that her job was to observe, not to grieve. But Redstone Flats hadn't been torn apart. It had simply stopped. The coffee mugs were still on the tables, half full, the liquid inside cold but unspilled. A child's drawing was pinned to a bulletin board near the community center entrance, a red house with yellow windows and a smiling sun, and it hung perfectly straight, undisturbed. The automated irrigation systems were still running in the agricultural dome on the settlement's eastern edge, pumping water through the soil of crops that nobody was alive to harvest. Somewhere deep in the residential block, a digital clock on someone's kitchen wall was counting the seconds with perfect indifference. 412 people had lived in Redstone Flats. They were all on the ground. The military liaison, Captain Darren Voss, consistently used the word "not dead" to correct himself during his briefings on the shuttle. "Not dead," he said. "Not yet." The settlers were in a state the field medics couldn't classify. Their vital signs were present, but reduced to a barely detectable murmur. Their eyes were open. Their pupils responded weakly to light. They breathed in slow, shallow rhythms, about 4 breaths per minute, and their skin had taken on a bluish-gray undertone. Mara initially attributed the faint bluish-gray undertone to poor lighting in the photographs she received. Standing in the corridor now, looking at the man lying against the wall beside the community center door, she realized the undertone wasn't a lighting artifact. It was real. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, weathered, and the kind of face that had spent decades in low-gravity agricultural labor. He was wearing work clothes and heavy boots, and his left hand was still loosely curled around the handle of a water flask, as though he had simply sat down to rest and forgotten to let go. His eyes were open and aimed at the ceiling. His chest rose. It fell. Rose again. She crouched beside him and held her scanner 3 inches from his face. The readings came back immediately, and she stared at them for a long time without moving. His motor pathways were almost entirely offline. Not damaged, offline. The neural signals that should have been traveling from his motor cortex down through his spinal column and out into his limbs were present at the source, but dissolving somewhere in the upper transmission chain, like a message being sent from a radio station that nobody could receive. His sensory systems were partially intact. His autonomic functions, heartbeat, respiration, and digestion, were running on what appeared to be a stripped-down emergency loop, governed by the deepest and most primitive regions of his brainstem. He was completely conscious. She was almost certain of it. She leaned closer, and she said quietly, "I'm Dr. Marachin. I'm from the Meridian Research Station. We're going to help you." She paused. "If you can hear me, I need you to know that we're here." His eyes didn't move, but at the corner of his right eye, a single tear formed and slid down toward his temple. She stood up and turned to Captain Voss, who was watching her from 3 feet away with his arms folded and his jaw tight. "They're aware," she said. "We know," he said. "That's not a coma. That's a paralytic state of extreme specificity. Whatever did take place didn't just knock them unconscious, it surgically removed motor function while keeping cognition intact." She looked back down the corridor, where body after corpse lay in the same peaceful, terrible stillness. "They've been lying here for how long?" 71 hours when we first arrived, Voss said. 86 now. "And the ones who were outdoors when it happened?" He didn't answer immediately. "Captain." "Gone," he said. "Whatever took them came back for the ones outside within the first few hours. The ones inside the pressurized structures were apparently not worth the entry effort. Or not yet." She absorbed that. "Not yet." "Atmospheric samples?" she asked. "Collected at arrival. Sent to 3 separate labs simultaneously. Results came back this morning. That's why you're here." He pulled out a data tablet and handed it to her. The labs couldn't identify the primary compound. It's not in any registry. It's not synthetic. The molecular geometry is biological in origin. But it doesn't match any known organism in the frontier catalogs. She took the tablet and looked at the molecular rendering. It was a large, complex structure, a polycyclic chain with what looked like receptor binding sites arranged in a configuration she had never seen. The binding sites weren't designed for any human neurotransmitter she recognized. But they had clearly found something to bind to, because 412 people were on the floor.
It's a spore, she said.
She scrolled through the spectral analysis. It's a biological spore. And look at this, it has a lipid membrane coating. That's why it bypassed the atmospheric filters. The filters are calibrated for synthetic particulate and standard organic matter. This thing is wrapped in a biological coat that reads as background organic debris. The filters let it through, Voss said flatly. The filters let it through, she confirmed. It was dressed up to look like pollen. She looked up at him. Who founded this settlement? One of the Outer Rim relay stations picked up an automated distress beacon 48 hours after contact was lost. And who sent the distress beacon? If everyone is on the floor... The settlement's AI management system triggered it automatically after detecting that no human interaction with colony systems had occurred for a 24-hour window. She nodded slowly. She looked at the man with the water flask again. 86 hours. She lay on a cold floor, fully conscious but unable to move, speak, or call for help. Staring at a ceiling. The sound of the irrigation systems reverberates in the background. She was observing the lights as they seamlessly transitioned from day to night. He was aware that something had taken the people outside, and that sooner or later it would come back. She had prepared herself for carnage. This was worse. She handed the tablet back to Captain Voss and pulled out her equipment case. I need full atmosphere collection across every room in this settlement, she said. I need tissue samples from at least 12 of the colonists, with their awareness noted and their consent attempted through blink response. I need whatever the Outer Rim relay station recorded in the 72 hours before contact was lost. And I need you to tell me everything you know about what actually took the people outside. Voss looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not reluctance, she thought. His expression resembled that of a man who had already witnessed something dreadful and was contemplating how to explain it to someone who hadn't. We have partial footage, he said, from the settlement's external cameras. Show me. He pulled up the footage on his tablet, and she watched. The creatures moved in a way that shouldn't have been possible for anything with solid biology. They were large. Her first impression was a flickering wrongness of scale, like a visual glitch, before her brain assembled them into coherent shapes. Four-limbed, but the limbs were articulated in too many places, folding and unfolding with a liquid efficiency that suggested a skeletal structure built on entirely different principles than vertebrate anatomy. Their surfaces were dark and non-reflective, which, in the external camera's low-light enhancement, rendered them as moving patches of deeper darkness against the night sky of the Outer Rim. They moved through the settlement's exterior with total confidence. No hesitation. They showed no apparent awareness of the cameras. They gathered the people who had been outside. She couldn't watch that part, and she didn't try to, and they left. The whole sequence lasted 11 minutes. At the very end, before the last creature moved out of frame, it paused. It turned toward one of the external cameras. It had no visible face in the human sense. But something was on its forward surface oriented toward the camera, and it stayed there for approximately 4 seconds before it turned and followed the others into the dark. Marachin stood in the corridor of Redstone Flats and looked at that frozen final frame on the tablet screen for a long time. She was not a soldier. She was a xenobiologist. And what she felt in that moment was not fear, exactly. It was something older and more precise than fear. It was the specific feeling of a mind confronting a system it did not yet understand, combined with the absolute, bone-level certainty that she was going to understand it. She was going to understand every single part of it. Captain, she said quietly, still looking at the screen. Get me a lab. The lab was a converted cargo module attached to the outer hull of the Perseverance, a mid-class scientific research vessel that the military had pulled off a survey mission in the Cassini Belt and rerouted to the frontier within 48 hours of Mara's request. It wasn't elegant. The walls were bare composite paneling, and the equipment had been installed in such a hurry that some of the spectrometer mounts were still held in place by emergency adhesive strips that the technicians promised would hold, mostly. But it had a Class 4 biological containment chamber, a full molecular analysis suite, and most importantly, it had her. She worked for 9 days without sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch. The spore, she designated it compound xylose. 1. Borrowing the name from the preliminary field classification the military xenologists had assigned to the creatures themselves before they knew anything about them, was the most precisely engineered biological weapon she had ever encountered. The word engineered was the one that stopped her, briefly, on the 4th day. She was sitting in front of the molecular display, a cold cup of coffee forgotten at her elbow, and she was looking at the feedback architecture of the compound's receptor binding mechanism, and she thought, this is not random evolutionary development. Natural toxins evolved toward efficiency through millions of years of trial and error. They were effective, but they carried the fingerprints of that process, redundant pathways, vestigial structures, and molecular features that once served a purpose and no longer did, left in place because evolution has no delete function. Compound xylose. One had none of that noise. Its architecture was clean in a way that biological systems almost never were. Every component served a current, active purpose. Every molecular feature connected to every other molecular feature in a chain of purposeful logic. Someone had designed this. Or, more precisely, something had been guiding its development for a very long time, selecting for the specific properties that made it maximally effective against a target species' neurology. The question that followed from that realization was deeply uncomfortable. Which target species? Because human neurology was not the obvious answer. The binding sites in compound xylose, one, were not optimized for human neurotransmitter receptors. They fit. Clearly they fit, given the evidence lying on the floors of Redstone Flats, but they fit in the way that a key fits a lock it wasn't quite made for. With effort. With some slippage. The paralytic effect was powerful, but it wasn't the perfect, elegant shutdown that a compound optimized for human biology would have produced. This suggests that the xylose hunters did not create this toxin specifically for human use. They had developed it for something else. Some other species. Something with a neurological architecture absent from Mara's databases, meaning either a species humanity had never encountered or one that no longer existed. She sat with that thought for a while. Then she moved on because the more immediately important discovery was already developing in her analysis feeds, and it was extraordinary. Compound xylose. One had a feedback component, buried in its molecular structure, alongside the receptor binding mechanism and the autonomic preservation pathway, which was itself remarkable. The deliberate engineering that kept prey alive and breathing while motor function was disabled was a third system. A signaling array. A set of molecular structures that, when the compound reached sufficient concentration in the biological host, began emitting a secondary chemical signal. The host's body produced a subtle, low-level aerosol emission, a metabolic byproduct of processing the toxin. A beacon. The paralyzed host was, without knowing it, broadcasting a chemical signal that the xylose hunters could apparently detect and navigate by. "Come here," the signal said. "The prey is ready." She stared at the analysis for a long time. The feedback loop was elegant. She hated how elegant it was. The hunters didn't need to watch their victims continuously. They could deploy the spores, move on, cover enormous territory, and then follow the beacon signals back to wherever the paralyzed prey had fallen. It was an efficient harvesting system for a predator that operated across large geographic and atmospheric ranges. But it was also a vulnerability. Because if the beacon signal could be detected and analyzed, and she was detecting and analyzing it right now in her cargo module laboratory from tissue samples collected with consent via painstaking blink-coded communication with settlers who were still lying on the floors of Redstone Flats, then the beacon signal could potentially be reproduced. Artificially. Without any host. She pulled up a blank modeling file and began working. On day 7, She sent a preliminary report to Captain Voss with a single flagged line at the top, marked for immediate escalation to military high command. I believe compound xylos. One contains an exploitable navigational vulnerability. Request authorization for cultivation research under Class 5 containment protocols. On day 9, the response came back. It was not from Captain Voss. The message was from Admiral Petra Sokolova, commander of the Outer Rim Defense Initiative, and was transmitted from the classified military command station at Lunar Base Artemis on a secured channel that required 3 separate authentication layers to open. The message was 4 sentences long. Dr. Chun, your preliminary report has been reviewed at the highest levels of the Defense Initiative. Authorization for cultivation research is granted under Protocol Nightshade. Report to Lunar Base Artemis within 72 hours. She closed the message. She looked at her molecular display, where compound xylos, one rotated slowly in its 3-dimensional rendering, its feedback beacon pulsing in the visualization as a faint blue light at the molecule's core. She thought about the man with the water flask. She thought about the 4 seconds that something without a visible face had spent staring at a camera before following its companions into the dark. She saved her files, shut down the non-essential systems, and began packing. Lunar Base Artemis was not on any public map. This was the first thing Mara noticed when the transport shuttle broke from its standard approach vector and began descending toward what the navigation system displayed as an unremarkable stretch of the lunar far side. No crater designation. No survey marker. The coordinates, as they descended, resolved into a complex of surface installations and subsurface structures, which were clearly substantial and had been there for some time. Protocol Nightshade, she thought. This wasn't built for me. The base had been constructed, she later learned, 8 years before the first Xylos contact. It had been built in response to a classified risk assessment generated by the Defense Initiative's Long-Range Xenological Threat Modeling Division, a division that, as far as the public was aware, did not exist. The assessment found, using advanced space analysis and bits of information from communication networks, that humans would meet at least one top predator species in the next 20 to 30 years, and that this meeting would likely not be friendly. The base had been built to be ready for something. I had just been waiting to find out what it was. Admiral Sokolova met her at the arrival bay, a tall woman in her late 50s with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that came from spending decades making decisions that could not be unmade. She shook Mara's hand once, firmly, and then led her through a series of secured corridors without small talk. The biodome complex was on sublevel 4. Mara stepped through the airlock, looked at what was inside, and stopped walking. The domes were enormous, each one a pressurized hemisphere perhaps 40 meters in diameter, climate-controlled to specific parameters that she immediately recognized from her models as optimal growth conditions for Xylos biological compounds. Inside the nearest dome, through the observation glass, she could see cultivation arrays, structured growth matrices, each one seeded with biological substrate derived from frontier soil samples and atmospheric concentrates collected from the Redstone Flats site, and 3 other colony locations she hadn't known were affected. 3 other colonies. How many? She asked. Redstone Flats was the 6th, Sokolova said. We contained information about the first 5 items. The settlers were recovered, those who could be recovered, and the sites were reclassified. The Xylos took some from each site. Yes. Mara looked at the cultivation arrays. And you've been growing this since. Since the 3rd site, our own xenobiologists made a partial version of the same discovery you made, the feedback beacon. They couldn't isolate it as cleanly as you did. Your work accelerated our timeline by approximately 2 years. Sokolova paused. That's why you're here, Dr. Chun. We didn't need your expertise to explain the compound's functions. We need someone who can make it do something it wasn't designed to do. The engineering team assigned to Protocol Nightshade was 12 people, 4 xenobiologists, including Mara, 3 atmospheric chemists, 2 military biohazard specialists, a materials engineer named Tom Adler, who had spent 15 years designing delivery systems for planetary terraforming agents, and 2 people whose exact roles were never fully explained to her, but who appear to have backgrounds in what she could only describe as practical lethality. The core challenge was not cultivation. The xylos spores, once properly seeded and climate-controlled, grew with the enthusiasm of something that had evolved to propagate aggressively in frontier atmospheric conditions. Within 6 weeks of Mara's arrival, the biodomes on sublevel 4 were producing concentrations of compound xylose, one that would have paralyzed the entire population of a mid-size Earth city if released into an open urban atmosphere. The core challenge was control. Compound xylose. One was an aerosol in its natural state. It traveled on air currents. It dispersed according to standard atmospheric diffusion physics. It settled slowly, and it persisted in still air environments for up to 40 hours. Those properties were excellent for a predator conducting passive area denial over large frontier territories. They were terrible for a weapon system that needed to be deployed with tactical precision, with defined boundaries, and with the ability to affect a specific zone without spreading beyond it. The compound, in its natural form, did not care about boundaries. Tom Adler was the one who solved it, on a Tuesday morning that Mara would remember for the rest of her life, when he walked into the primary lab carrying a physical prototype and set it on the table in front of her with the expression of a man who had not slept in 31 hours, but had spent those hours extremely productively. It was a sphere, roughly the size of a large grapefruit, made of a matte gray material that she didn't immediately recognize. Calcium silicate shell, he said, sitting down heavily. Biodegradable. Fractures on atmospheric impact or remote trigger. Inside the shell, the compound is suspended in a pressure-stabilized lipid matrix, borrowed from the compound's own natural coating mechanism, actually. We're using the spore's own biological chemistry to keep it stable in storage. He leaned forward. When the shell fractures, the matrix disperses as a fine aerosolized cloud. Dispersion radius is controlled by the internal pressure charge, adjustable from roughly 2 meters to about 40 meters, depending on deployment parameters. The lipid matrix degrades in approximately 90 minutes in standard atmospheric conditions, which collapses the active cloud. Mara looked at the sphere. 90-minute window, she said. 90-minute window. After that, the compound's active binding capacity drops below the effective threshold, and it becomes inert particulate. He paused. The affected zone clears. Anyone who was in the zone during those 90 minutes is already down. Anything that wasn't is fine. And the feedback beacon component? The signal the compound emits from paralyzed hosts. Adler smiled for the first time. It was a tired smile, but genuine. We can tune it, he said. We isolated the beacon emitter structure separately, and we can produce it synthetically, independent of the full compound. Which means we can seed an area with a beacon signal without deploying the full paralytic agent. He reached into his kit and produced a second object, smaller, cylindrical, no larger than a signal flare. This produces pure beacon emission. Nothing else. No paralytic compound. Just the signal. She understood immediately. You lure them to a location, she said. You lure them to a location, he confirmed. And in that location, you've already deployed the full compound. They follow their navigation signal directly into an active field. She was quiet for a moment.
Tom, she said.
You've made a trap that uses the hunter's own senses as the bait. I've made a trap that uses the hunter's own senses as the bait, he agreed. She picked up the larger sphere. It was lighter than she expected. The calcium silicate shell was thin but evidently strong enough for safe handling. She turned it in her hands slowly. The xylose had spent some unknowable span of time perfecting a biological system for taking prey. Patient, elegant, sophisticated, an achievement of biological engineering that she genuinely admired on a purely scientific level, in the detached part of her mind that still functioned as a scientist even when the rest of her was something harder and more focused. They had perfected it, and they had deployed it against humanity, and they had not, apparently, considered the possibility that humanity would take it apart. She set the sphere down carefully. When can we begin field trials? She asked. The test site was a decommissioned mining installation on Callisto, deep enough in the outer system to be far from civilian populations, large enough in its tunnel and surface network to provide realistic deployment environments, and conveniently already contaminated with enough industrial residue that any anomalous atmospheric readings would be attributable to the mining legacy rather than classified weapons testing. When motivated, Mara found the military's logistical creativity genuinely impressive. The first 3 field trials were conducted without live Xylos presence. They used atmospheric sensor arrays to measure compound dispersion, beacon signal propagation, and shell integrity across a range of deployment scenarios. Ground-based, aerial-dropped, and hand-thrown variants of the sphere, which the project team had begun calling informally siren units, after the mythological creatures that lured sailors to their deaths, performed within acceptable parameters. Adler refined the pressure charge calibration after the first trial. Mara adjusted the lipid matrix concentration after the second measurement. By the third trial, the dispersion profiles were clean and repeatable. The fourth trial was different. 3 days before the fourth trial, a deep space monitoring station at the frontier's edge picked up a Xylos approach signature, a characteristic pattern of non-reflective mass moving in loose formation that the Defense Initiative's newly trained detection teams had learned to identify. The formation was heading toward an area of the frontier that included, among other things, the Callisto test site. Admiral Sokolova did not cancel the fourth trial. She reframed it. Mara stood in the command observation post, a buried prefab structure 3 kilometers from the test site's main surface entrance, and watched on the sensor feeds as a small team of Defense Initiative personnel moved across the surface of Callisto, wearing standard-issue Frontier worksuits. They carried nothing that looked like weapons. They moved like settlers. They had seeded the surface around the main entrance with siren units buried at 2-centimeter depth and had planted 3 beacon emitters in a triangle pattern approximately 40 meters out from the entrance, close enough to draw anything following the signal toward the kill zone, far enough that the approach would be clear of the active compound field. Then they went inside. And they waited. Mara watched the thermal sensors. For 40 minutes, nothing moved on the surface. Then the sensors picked them up. 4 contacts. They were approaching from the east, moving in that fluid, uncoordinated manner she had initially observed in the external camera footage of Redstone Flats. They were traveling fast, faster than she had expected, faster than the footage from Redstone had suggested, and they moved with the absolute confidence of apex predators approaching a known feeding opportunity. They were following the beacon. She realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly. The 4 contacts reached the beacon triangle. They slowed. They moved in the searching pattern that the sensor analysts had cataloged from previous observation data, a wide, methodical sweep that appeared to be sensory confirmation behavior, verifying that the beacon's signal matched a genuine paralyzed prey concentration before committing to collection. They moved through the triangle, and then they moved toward the entrance, and they were directly over the buried siren field when Mara said, quietly, to the trigger technician beside her, "Now." The technician pressed the remote detonation control. The surface of Callisto, in a roughly 30-meter radius around the installation entrance, bloomed with a fine, barely visible mist. The 4 Xylos contacts stopped moving. Not gradually. It wasn't as if a paralyzed human body gradually lost coordination and sank to the ground. Suddenly, they experienced a sense of completeness that was almost peaceful in its entirety. One moment they were moving. In the next moment they were gone. They were on the ground. The observation post was silent for a long moment. "Contact time to effect," said a sensor analyst behind her. "Approximately 8 seconds. 8 seconds. Compound Xylos 1, when concentrated in the volumes the siren units produced over a small area, was significantly more effective against its original target biology than it had ever been against human settlers. This was, Mara had theorized, because the original target species, the compound had been developed for before humanity entered the equation, had a neurological architecture closer to the Xylos hunters themselves. The compound fit their neural receptors not like a slightly wrong key, but like the key it had actually been made for. 8 seconds. The 4 Xylos hunters lay motionless on the surface of Callisto, their too many joints folded at improbable angles, the non-reflective surfaces of their bodies absorbing the pale, distant sunlight with perfect indifference. Mara looked at them for a long time. She was thinking about the man with the water flask. She was thinking about 86 hours of ceiling staring, tear-streaked consciousness, the irrigation systems running, and nobody coming. She was thinking about the 4 seconds that one of these creatures had spent staring at a camera before it left. She was not, she told herself carefully, feeling satisfaction. She was feeling something more complex than that. A sense of systems resolving, of a broken equation being corrected, not by victory but by the restoration of balance. The demonstration showed that predation was not a fixed hierarchy but a temporary condition, susceptible to the intelligence of whatever it had chosen to underestimate. "Recovery teams move in," said Admiral Sokolova's voice over the command channel. Mara turned away from the sensor display. She had work to do. The ethical committee met for the first time on a Wednesday. It had been convened at Mara's request, a fact that Admiral Sokolova received with something between respect and mild exasperation, the expression of a military commander who understood the necessity of oversight and wished, on a purely logistical level, that the person demanding it had better timing. The fourth field trial was 6 days ago. The Defense Initiative was already planning operational deployment. 3 frontier colonial clusters were under active threat assessment, and the military's position was straightforward. The siren system worked, it was ready, and every week of deliberation was a week that more settlers were potentially exposed to Xylos harvesting operations, which are efforts to extract resources from the planet Xylos. All of that was true. It was also true that humanity was, for the first time in its history as a spacefaring species, preparing to deploy a biological weapon of alien origin against a living species, a species that was almost certainly sapient, almost certainly possessed of culture and social structure, and perhaps something that functioned like a worldview, and that this decision deserved more than a logistics timeline. Mara sat at the committee table and made her case. "I'm not arguing against deployment," she said, clearly and early, because she knew that framing mattered. "I think we don't yet know what we're doing." Across the table, Dr. James Okafor, the Defense Initiative's senior xenological ethics advisor, a man she had read extensively and respected deeply, leaned forward. "What specifically do we not understand?"
"The Xylos," she said.
"We know they are apex predators. We know they use compound Xylos, one to paralyze prey. We know they harvest biological matter. We know this because of the colonists they took from the frontier sites." She paused. "We don't know if they harvest for sustenance, for cultural practice, or for something else entirely. We don't know if their interaction with humanity represents a deliberate act of war or the simple extension of a hunting behavior that predates any awareness of what humanity is." "Does the distinction matter?" said one of the military representatives, "if the outcome is the same?" "It matters for everything that comes after this battle," she said. "If the Xylos are conducting purely instinct-driven predation, if they are, in the relevant sense, hunting rather than waging war, then our deployment of the siren system will be experienced by them as something they have no framework to interpret. They will not understand what happened. They cannot negotiate a change in behavior because they may lack the cognitive architecture for that kind of meta-awareness." She looked around the table. "We may win a battle while making a diplomatic resolution permanently impossible." "And if they are waging war?" Okafor asked. "Then we have different problems, but at least we're in a domain where communication is theoretically possible." She folded her hands on the table. "I'm not asking to delay deployment indefinitely. I'm asking for 2 things. 1, that we continue parallel efforts to establish any possible communication channel with the Xylos before and during deployment. And 2, that we document clearly and honestly what we are doing and why, so that whatever comes after us, including the Xylos if they survive, has access to a truthful account." There was a silence. Admiral Sokolova, who had been quiet throughout, said, "The first request is already being pursued by a separate team. This process began as early as 3 days ago." She met Mara's eyes. "The second request I will authorize personally." Mara nodded. She had not expected to win the argument entirely. She had expected to be heard, and she had been heard. In the architecture of institutions under pressure, she knew that sometimes that was the most that could be secured. She left the committee room and walked down the corridor toward the biodome complex, and she thought about the man with the water flask, and she thought about the 4-second camera stare, and she thought about a species that had been perfecting a biological weapon for longer than humanity had been watching stars. "Caro," she told herself. The word was from her grandmother's dialect, a term of old-fashioned fortitude that her family used in the way others might say, "hold steady" or "press on." Her grandmother had used it for everything from difficult school exams to hospital waiting rooms to the kind of grief that didn't have a bottom.
Caro, she thought. Keep going.
There is more to understand. There was always more to understand. The Battle of New Europa was not what the history files would later call a battle. It was a demonstration. New Europa, which was the third largest human colony in the outer frontier with a population of 60,000 and focused on ocean research and agriculture, had been identified by Defense Initiative Intelligence as a likely target for 11 days before the attack was confirmed. 60,000 people were too many to evacuate quickly, and the attempt would have triggered a panic that could have been as damaging as the attack itself. Admiral Sokolova made the decision that the Defense Initiative had been preparing to make since the first Siren unit passed its field trial. New Europa would not be evacuated. New Europa would be defended. Mara was not present at New Europa. She was at Lunar Base Artemis, watching tactical feeds with the rest of the Protocol Nightshade team, and she was aware, with a clarity that the clinical language of tactical briefings could not quite contain, that 60,000 people were living their ordinary lives in the habitat domes, research stations, and agricultural corridors of New Europa, most of them unaware of what was approaching and what was about to be done in the space above and around their homes. The Xylos approach formation was larger than anything the Defense Initiative had tracked before. 17 distinct signatures. The scale of the harvesting operation would have resulted in catastrophic consequences if left unchecked. The Defense Initiative's response was structured in 3 layers. The outer layer was beacon emission, a network of automated beacon emitters deployed by unmanned drones in a wide shell around New Europa's atmospheric envelope. From the Xylos perspective, New Europa was broadcasting the strongest paralyzed prey signal ever recorded. The signal was 17 times stronger than the typical colony signature. An irresistible concentration. The middle layer was Siren deployment, an array of atmospheric delivery systems based on Adler's shell design but scaled for aerial dispersal across a large volume, seeded throughout the zone that the outer beacon layer was designed to draw the Xylos formation into. The inner layer used standard methods, because Mara convinced the committee that the Siren system should scare off the Xylos and respond first, not kill them, and that any Xylos that got through the compound field should be allowed to escape before using regular force. She watched the feeds. The Xylos formation entered the outer beacon shell and accelerated. They were moving fast, even faster than the Callisto observation data had suggested was their top speed. The beacon signal was pulling them in with the urgency of a concentrated feeding opportunity, the kind of signal that in their history had probably meant an entire colony's worth of paralyzed prey waiting for collection. They hit the Siren field at full approach velocity. The effect was not instantaneous at this scale. The compound was dispersed across a large volume, and the Xylos were moving through it rather than lying stationary in a concentrated cloud. The tactical feeds showed the formation beginning to lose coherence about 40 seconds after initial exposure. Approach vectors are becoming irregular, speed dropping. And then, over the next 3 minutes, one by one, the 17 approach signatures slow to stillness. 14 of the 17 came to rest in the compound field. 3 broke off. The 3 that broke off accelerated away from New Europa on a vector that the trajectory analysts confirmed, within minutes, was a direct return heading toward the deep space origin coordinates that the Defense Initiative had been attempting to triangulate for months. Sokolova let them go. Mara, watching from Artemis, thought she understood why. The 3 that escaped had the message. The Xylos would not understand the mechanism, not immediately, perhaps not for a long time. But they would understand the outcome. They had approached a prey colony with 17 hunters in formation. 14 had fallen, the colony was intact, and 3 had run. Something changed, the message said. Something here is different now. Whether that message would be received as a call to war or a reason for caution, whether the Xylos had the cognitive framework to process it as information rather than simply as loss, she didn't know. The communication team was still working. The ethical committee was still meeting. The parallel processes that she had argued for were still running. She sat in the observation room at Artemis, and she watched the 14 Xylos signatures lying motionless in the space above New Europa, and she thought, "Ab SYMJHY," another phrase from her grandmother's lexicon meaning, "Now I must, a phrase that signaled not triumph in completion but the recognition that a threshold had been crossed, and the work on the other side of it was already waiting. Now I must understand what comes next. Part 7. The Apex Redefined. What came next was not celebration. This surprised some people, she noticed. The Defense Initiative personnel who had been part of Protocol Nightshade for years, the people who had built the biodomes and run the atmospheric simulations and calibrated the siren units through 100 iterations, many of them had expected a moment of collective relief, if not outright joy, when New Europa held. When 60,000 people went about their ordinary Tuesday with no knowledge of what had moved through the space above them and been stopped. What they got instead was silence, and then the beginning of something much more complicated. The 14 Xylos who had been paralyzed above New Europa were still alive. The compound's autonomic preservation pathway, the same engineered feature that had kept the Redstone Flats settlers breathing during 86 hours of floor staring, was keeping them alive 3 kilometers above the clouds of New Europa's lower atmosphere, in the cold and the dark, fully conscious, unable to move. This had not been part of the plan. Or rather, it had been a known outcome, flagged in the deployment projections and accepted as a secondary problem to be addressed after the primary threat was neutralized. Now it was the primary problem, and it was one that Mara had been thinking about since the Callisto Field trial, when she had watched 4 Xylos hunters go down in 8 seconds and stood in a command post thinking about the man with the water flask. She had spent 86 days on this problem in parallel with everything else. She quietly worked on this problem in the margins of Protocol Nightshade, filling the hours between compound analysis sessions, committee meetings, and Adler's calibration reviews. The problem was this. Compound Xylos' once paralytic effect was temporary. In people, like the settlers from Redstone Flats who were treated and mostly healed physically after 3 months, the effects of the compound started to wear off after about 90 to 120 hours, but their mental recovery would take much longer. The motor function gradually returned, reversing the order of its loss. In the Xylos, the timeline was unknown. And unknown meant that the 14 Xylos above New Europa were going to recover motor function at a time, and in a manner that nobody could predict, 3 kilometers above a human colonial hub, in a state of presumably intense disorientation, and, perhaps, something that functioned like terror. Mara had spent 86 days developing what she formally titled the Guided Recovery Protocol, and what the Protocol Nightshade team had taken to calling, with the affectionate irreverence of people under sustained pressure, the wake-up plan. It was not a weapon. It was, as far as she could make it, the opposite of a weapon, designed to promote healing and recovery rather than destruction, aiming to restore the Xylos to a state of well-being and functionality. She had theorized, carefully and with significant uncertainty, that the Xylos in a paralyzed state were conscious. The feedback beacon mechanism needed a living host to work, which suggested that the compound was made to keep its victims aware, since a dead host wouldn't send a signal. The deliberate engineering of the autonomic preservation pathway made sense only if the prey was meant to remain alive, which implied that the Xylos knew their prey was living when they collected it. This implied that the Xylos were at ease with the collection of conscious, aware, living beings. She didn't let herself dwell on what that implied about what happened after collection. That was a problem for another team, in another time when there was more information and hopefully more options, such as potential ethical considerations or alternative methods of collection that could be explored, which might include non-invasive techniques or improved consent processes to ensure the well-being of the collected beings. Instead, she focused on the opposite side of the question. If the Xylos knew their prey was conscious during paralysis, if that was a feature of the system rather than an incidental detail, then the Xylos themselves had experienced paralysis. They had developed a biological weapon that produced a state they were familiar with. This may have been a state they experienced at some point in their evolutionary or cultural history due to whatever predator occupied the apex position before them. She was speculating. She knew she was speculating. But the speculation was grounded in the molecular evidence, and it led her toward a possibility that she found, against the weight of everything that had happened to human settlers on the frontier, against the full knowledge of what Redstone Flats and the 5 other sites had been, she found herself unable to dismiss. The Xylos knew what it felt like to be taken. They had built a system that harmed others. This was not a justification. It was not an excuse. It was a data point. This fragment could potentially serve as the foundation for a comprehensive understanding, not one of forgiveness or condonation, but one of understanding of the nature of the Xylos. The wake-up plan involved, at its core, three elements. The first part was physical, a remote release of a counteragent created by the protocol nightshade chemists along with the siren system, a substance that sped up the breakdown of compound Xylos 1's receptor binding, cutting the time the paralysis lasted from over 90 hours to about 6. This was not an antidote, nor a complete reversal, but rather a controlled shortening of the paralysis effect's duration, with motor function gradually returning over the 6-hour period instead of all at once. The second was spatial. Unmanned drones that would gently reposition the paralyzed Xylos, 14 enormous, very alien, very unconscious apex predators floating in open space, to a location well away from New Europa's atmosphere, on a vector that pointed outward toward the deep frontier and not toward any human habitat. The third was, she acknowledged, more an act of hope than of science, a signal. Broadcast on every frequency that the Defense Initiative's communications teams thought Xylos could detect, the same frequencies used by the feedback beacon, the navigation pheromones, and others found in areas where Xylos were known to be active. The signal was simple. It was the chemical makeup of compound Xylos 1's paralyzing part, shown as a pattern of frequencies, followed by the chemical makeup of the antidote, shown the same way, followed by a repeating message that meant, as clearly as she could without a common language, "This is over. You are free. Do not return." She was not certain they would understand it. She was not certain they could understand it.
But she was certain that she had to try.
Admiral Sokolova approved the wake-up plan without the committee. The operational timeline didn't allow it, and then submitted the full decision to the committee record with a personal note that Mara read twice and then saved in a private file. Dr. Chen's insistence on this protocol represents, I believe, the difference between humanity winning a battle and humanity making a mistake we cannot undo. I don't know if it will work. I know it had to be attempted. The counteragent was dispersed. The drones repositioned the 14 Xylos. The signal broadcast began. Mara sat in the observation room at Artemis and watched the sensor feeds. 6 hours later, the paralyzed signatures above New Europa, now repositioned to deep space, began to move. Slowly, at first, erratic. The disorientation of recovered motor function occurred in beings who had, presumably, never experienced the Xylos compound from the other side. Then gradually more purposeful, the movements of creatures reorienting to their own bodies, to the environment around them, to whatever sensory apparatus they used to read the space they found themselves in. None of them moved toward New Europa. All 14 moved, over the next 2 hours, in the same direction that the 3 survivors of the initial formation had fled, toward the deep frontier.
Away.
Mara let out a breath. The Ethical Committee's final report was published internally 3 months after New Europa, and Mara read every page of it twice. It was a document of unusual honesty, the kind of institutional honesty that was rare and, she suspected, would not survive contact with the political environments that were going to start paying attention to Protocol Nightshade very soon. The report concluded that the circumstances justified the siren system as a defensive deployment. It also concluded, in language that Mara had partially drafted and that Okafor had refined, that the siren system was not a solution. It was a condition. A temporary state of affairs in which the balance of biological capability had shifted in humanity's favor, but which remained inherently unstable because capability advantage was not the same thing as security, and security ultimately required either elimination or understanding, and elimination was both practically difficult and morally catastrophic, which left understanding. Understanding was going to take a very long time. The communication team's progress, as of 3 months after New Europa, was best described as, "We believe we are transmitting. We cannot confirm we are being received. We have no evidence of response." Okafor pointed out during one of their regular working lunches that this was not the same as silence. The absence of a response was not evidence of a lack of reception. It might mean the Xylos were ignoring the signal. It might mean they were processing it. It might mean they had a concept of response time that made the 3 months humanity had been waiting feel like the first microsecond of a much longer conversation. The Defense Initiative deployed siren capabilities across all frontier colonial hubs within 6 months of New Europa. The deployment was, publicly, described as an advanced atmospheric monitoring system upgrade. The actual nature of Protocol Nightshade would not be disclosed publicly for another 4 years. Mara spent those 4 years at Lunar Base Artemis, working on 2 simultaneous projects that she thought of as the 2 sides of the same question. The first was the continued development of the siren system, not its expansion or escalation, but its refinement. Longer-range beacon detection. The system aimed to achieve more precise control over compound concentrations. Counteragent development for use in scenarios where collateral paralysis needed to be reversed quickly. She thought of this work as maintaining the condition, keeping the deterrent functional, keeping the balance stable, and giving humanity the continued ability to say, "We are not easy prey." The second part was about communication, working together with the communication team and more xenolinguists and biosemiotic experts to create a possible language that used molecular signals, light emissions, and biological chemistry. A language that was not built for human mouths or Xylo's sensory organs, but for the space between them. This work was slower. It was, honestly, slower than continental drift. There were weeks when it felt like trying to build a bridge across an ocean with no knowledge of the far shore's geography. But there were also moments, small moments. The communication team identified anomalies in the deep space spectral monitoring data as potentially non-random, patterns in the background emission from Xylo's associated space that appeared to react, with a delay of weeks or months, to specific signal sequences that humanity had broadcast. Not clearly, not unmistakably, but not quite like noise either. Maybe, perhaps, possibly. These were not words that military briefings liked. Mara had learned to be comfortable with those words because they were honest, and only honest words built anything real. His name was David Reyes. She found this out on a Tuesday afternoon, 14 months after Redstone Flats, when she received a message from the Meridian Regional Recovery Center, where the Redstone settlers had been rehabilitated. The message was from the center's coordinator, and it said that one of the recovered settlers had expressed a wish to speak with her if she was willing. She was willing. David Reyes was 53 years old, a second-generation frontier agricultural worker who had spent 22 years on the Outer Rim before Redstone Flats. He was a large man. She recognized him immediately from the corridor, from the broad shoulders and the weathered face, though he was upright now and looking directly at her across a communication screen instead of staring at a ceiling with a tear drying on his temple. He had motor function back in everything except the last 2 fingers of his left hand, which the medical team thought might return fully over time or might not. He was in therapy. He slept badly. He told her, without being asked, that he was doing okay. "I wanted to thank you," he said. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "I know I don't have to." He looked at her steadily. "I want to. I know what you did. Most of it, anyway. I am familiar with the portions they have shared with us." He paused. "I know you're not done." "I'm not done," she agreed. "The things that did it to us," he said. "Do you think they knew what they were doing to us?" "Not technically. I mean, do you think they knew it was like it was? What it felt like?" She was quiet for a moment. "I think they knew their prey was alive," she said carefully. "Whether they understood what that meant for the prey, whether they had a framework for it, I honestly don't know yet." He nodded slowly. "That's a more honest answer than I expected." "I'm trying to be honest," she said. "It's the only approach that leads somewhere useful." He looked at her for another moment. "My daughter was on Redstone with me," he said. "She was 7. She's fine. Motor function completely restored, they say. She doesn't have nightmares about it the way I do." He paused. "She asked me last week what you're trying to do now. I told her you're trying to talk to them." "That's roughly accurate." She said that sounded hard. "It is hard." She said you should keep trying anyway. Mara looked at the man with the water flask, upright now, hands in his lap, both of them, the last 2 fingers of his left hand slightly curled in a way that might or might not resolve, and she thought, "Symjhy. Now I must. Tell her I will," Mara said. Word of New Europa did not stay contained. Mara had told Sokolova, Okafor, and anyone else who would listen in the months after the battle that it wouldn't. The galaxy, meaning the other sapient species that humanity had made cautious diplomatic contact with in the decades since first achieving deep space travel, was paying attention to the frontier in the way that neighbors pay attention to a loud argument next door. The galaxy, with awareness, anxiety, and a careful pretense of non-involvement, was closely monitoring every development. The Meridian Collective, humanity's closest interstellar diplomatic partners, a loose federation of 3 species who occupied a cluster of systems 2 transit months from the frontier, sent a formal inquiry to Earth's Diplomatic Council within 8 months of New Europa. The inquiry was phrased in the diplomatic register that the collective preferred, layered, oblique, and technically a request for information sharing rather than an expression of concern. But its underlying message was clear. What did you do? And what does it mean that you did it? The Diplomatic Council's response was drafted by a committee that included, among many others, Dr. James Okafor and one Dr. Mara Chin, in an advisory capacity that she had not sought and accepted only because Okafor told her, with gentle insistence, that someone needed to be in the room who understood that the answer to the collective's question was complex and should remain so. Humanity had not evolved into a predatory entity. That was the crux of her argument in the drafting sessions, the final response, and what she needed the collective and anyone else who was paying attention to understand. Humanity had become something harder to categorize than an apex predator. Apex predation was a fixed position in a fixed hierarchy. It was stable precisely because it was static. The apex predator occupied its position, the prey occupied their position, and the system persisted because both parties had internalized their roles. What humanity had demonstrated at New Europa was not the seizure of an apex position. It was a demonstration that hierarchy itself was not fixed. A species occupying a prey position could study the system it was embedded in, understand its mechanisms, and change the conditions that defined it as prey. That intelligence applied to biology, applied to chemistry, applied to the patient, and the iterative work of understanding a system you didn't design and didn't choose, that this was a force that didn't fit anywhere in a predator-prey framework. The collective took 3 months to respond to the request. When they did, their message was long and carefully structured, and its core was a question that Mara found genuinely surprising in its precision. If you are not prey and not predator, what are you? She drafted the answer herself, with Okafor's assistance. We don't know yet, the answer said. We are trying to find out. We would like to find out in a galaxy that has room for that kind of question. The collective's next response came back in 11 days, fast, by their diplomatic standards. It contained a single phrase in the collective's primary formal register, which the translation team rendered as, "We think that is the right kind of question." For years after New Europa, the spectral monitoring team at Lunar Base Artemis flagged an emission pattern in the deep frontier that met the threshold for a probable non-random signal. Not a confirmed response. No communication established. Probable. Non-random. The 2 words hovered on the brink of meaning, struggling to hold on. Mara was in the biodome complex on sublevel 4 when the flag came through, doing a routine check on the cultivation arrays, which she still personally reviewed once a week because she believed that the scientist who had created something remained responsible for understanding it fully, and full understanding required regular, direct contact with the thing itself. She read the log on her tablet, standing among the growth matrices where compound xylose 1, a genetically modified organism, grew in patient, amplified abundance, and she stood very still for a moment. The monitoring team observed that the emission patterns seemed to be based on the molecular signature sequences that humans had been sending out to communicate, sequences that she had designed to mean this is over. You are free, do not return. But the pattern was not just repeating those sequences. But the pattern was not a repetition of those sequences. It was a variation. Specifically, and here the monitoring team's analysis note became cautious, hedged with appropriate scientific tentativeness that she nevertheless found she was reading with her heart rate elevated. The variation appeared to take the molecular sequence that represented this end and modify it in a way that the team's biosemiotic specialist described as potentially indicative of a temporal inflection, possibly meaning something more like not yet ended, or still ongoing, or in process. In process. She looked up from the tablet, at the growth matrices, at compound xylose. one growing in its careful containment, the biological terror that had been used to paralyze her species, cultivated now in her species' laboratories, studied and understood, and turned into something that had, so far, kept 60,000 people alive on New Europa, and had sent 14 apex predators back into the deep frontier without anyone dying. In process, the Xylos, if the signal was what the monitoring team thought it might be, were saying, "We are still active." She had been afraid of that sentence once. She had rehearsed her response to it in the clinical, analytical part of her mind that prepared for bad outcomes. Not done could mean we are preparing a larger assault. This could indicate that we are formulating a strategy to counter your counterattack. It could mean any number of things in the register of predation and conflict, such as a strategic pause to assess the situation or a shift in tactics based on new intelligence. But it could also mean that we received your signal and are still deciding what to do with it. It could mean we are processing a situation we have never encountered before. It could mean something changed, and we are still in the process of understanding what.